All right, we've got one more thing that we're going to go through here in this chapter. And so we've just talked about conditional statements. We talked about the if statement, the switch statement, and the conditional operator. Let's move on now to looping statements. So loops perform the same action several times on different values. We talked about arrays and how an array can hold different values, several values, and often you'll want to do the same thing to each value in that array. For example, you may have collected an array of all the paragraph elements in your HTML, and you want to apply a class to them all. Or, for example, you may want to take a string, split it into an array of words, and we'll see how to do this later on. And once that string is an array of words, you want to perform the same action to each of those words. So you use a loop in each of these cases. So let's create an array right now, an array of names. So remember, arrays are square brackets. So we will just use the names John, Paul, George, Ringo. So, oops, I forgot. Let's call this names. So we have a variable called names that is an array of 4 items. All right, so now we want to do something for each item in that array. So this is the for loop. Basically what this means is for each item in the array, perform a given set of actions. So let's say for, and now we have some things in parentheses here that we'll come back to in a second. And then we have our block, delimited again by curly braces. So there are 3 things that we do inside these parentheses. The first one is set any variables that we'll need for the loop. Well, first of all, think of this. Do you remember how we access items in an array? We access them by their index number. So if I say names 1, or we'll say 2 in this case, what does names 2 equal? Well, names 2 equals George. Because you'll remember that arrays are 0-based indexed. So names 0 would equal John, names 1 would equal Paul, and names 2 equals George. So what we need is a number that we're going to use to access this. So we'll call this number I for index or increment or iterator. So we're just going to set a variable in here I. Now, I mentioned earlier, it's a good practice to declare all your variables at once. So we could just put I up there, and then down here, just say I to give it a value down here, and just declare it up there, but initialize the value down here. All right, so that's what you do in the first part. Notice I have a semicolon after that. We'll be talking about semicolons again in a minute here. In the second part, we have a condition. What this condition says is, if this condition is true, run the loop. So in this case, let's say names I. So names I, what is that going to do? Well, I in this case is 0, remember? So names 0, what that's going to do is get the value that's at the ith place in the array names. Now, if there is a value in the ith place, it will return that value. And since this is this will be evaluated as a condition, it will return the Boolean value for that value. If that value does not exist, for example, let's say for example, back up here, if we say names 4, well, we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 is going to return undefined because there's nothing there, right? Undefined is going to evaluate false as a Boolean, and so this condition will be false. So once we hit the 4th item here, or the 5th item really, it's going to be false because there's no more items in the array, and we will not execute the loop anymore. So this condition, if this condition is true, the loop will execute once again. The final thing to do is to increment that I variable. So we can do I++. What this does is, as we discussed, the postfix operator, it will increment the I variable by 1. And this takes place after we execute the loop. So think of it like this. The first section here initializes anything we need to any variables we need for the loop to work properly. The second section here is run before we execute each loop to see if we should execute each loop. It's a condition. And the third is run after each time we run the loop to prepare for the next loop running. So the first time we run this loop, well, let's put something in here. We'll say console.log. We'll just say hello, and then we'll use the concatenation operator. We'll say names I. Well, let's see how this works, and then we'll come back and discuss what it does. I'll just delete that line there. Look down here in the console. If I refresh this, we say hello John, hello Paul, hello George, and hello Ringo. All right. So here's what's going on here. We hit the for loop here. So we're going to just walk through it the same way the JavaScript engine does. I equals 0. So we set that variable. Next, we check the condition. Is there a value in I in the ith spot? Well, in this case, I equals 0. The names array has something at spot 0. That's John. Since John is a string with text in it returns true as a Boolean, as we've seen. So we do execute the loop again. Finally, so we'll actually execute the loop. Hello, names I. In this case, names I. Remember, I is 0. So names I refers to John. As you can see, the first time we got John. After we've executed all the code in the loop, we increment I by 1. After we increment I by 1, I equals 1. So then we do run the condition again. Names 1. Is there a value at index number 1? Index number 1 is Paul. That's a string, so it returns as a true value. Yes, so we'll execute the code in the block again. We get hello Paul. Same thing for George, same thing for Ringo. After we execute this code hello Ringo, remember Ringo is at index 3. So names I as Ringo, I equals 3. We increment I by 1 again, I becomes 4. Names 4, is there a value at the spot for names 4? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. That will return undefined, which is false, and we exit the for loop. All right, so I want to make sure you understand exactly how the for loop works. We just walked through it, but let me tell you this. Each of these 3 statements that we have in the setup parentheses here are optional. So let's see how this would work. Well, you can see how the first one would be optional. When we're setting our variables at the top here, we could just say I equals 0, and then leave this out. Now, I've just taken out that semicolon, but we need to leave the semicolon. So basically what we're putting here is a blank statement. We're saying do nothing, semicolon. We still need the semicolon, otherwise it will think that names I is supposed to be the first one, and names I is supposed to actually be the second one. So we put that semicolon there so it knows that we've already done the work for spot 1. We've already set up for this for loop. And if I execute this, you can see that everything still works fine. How about incrementing I by 1? Actually, before we get there, look at this. On the other hand, we could do 2 things in here. So let me just take that right out of there. And in here, let's set up I. Whoops. We can say var I equals 0. And then we can actually set up another variable. Let's say length. Or actually, we'll just say len, short for length, equals names.length. Now remember we talked about properties with objects? Then every array has a length property. In this case, the length property of this array is 4, because there are 4 items in the array. What we can do now here in the condition is change this to, well, I is less than length. This is actually a smart thing to do because this type of condition will be quicker for the JavaScript engine to run than the condition we had where it had to look up each item in the array. So it's actually more popular to do something like, well, I is less than names.length. However, if you have a lot of items in the array where the for loop is going to be executing many times, each little lookup to names.length is going to add a bit of time to your execution. It's actually faster to almost, quote, cache names.length into a variable as we're doing here, because it is a bit more expensive for the JavaScript engine to access a property than it is for it to access just a normal variable like this. So what we've done here is we say, let's create two variables in the initialization section. We change the condition here, and this will still work. If we come over here and refresh the page, you can see we still have our 4 values there. What I should do is just clear them so you can see that they are actually being regenerated each time I refresh that page. What about this section here where we increment I by 1? Well, who says that has to go inside the loop up there? Why don't we put it down here? And so that inside the loop, after we do everything we want to, right at the end, we increment I by 1, and then we just leave that blank, say don't do anything up there. Let me clear this again, refresh it, and you'll see that's working just fine. So we could do this. Let me take that out of there. Let me actually do I0 length equals names dot length. I can do that up there. I can't forget that semicolon there. And now all we have in here is I is less than length. And yes, that works. Now you might say, well, why don't you take I is less than length out too? Or if you were going to take it out, how would the loop know how many times to loop? Well, the truth is we could take it out, but what it's going to do is loop forever. And this will either crash the browser or bring up an error. So let me see. We have absolutely no condition going on in there. It's going to try to go on forever. Let me refresh this, and you can see the UI has already hung here. I'm getting the pinwheel spinning. Since this is Firefox, it'll probably recover. In a second here, it's going to say, this script is going to run forever. Do you want to stop the script, or do you want it to keep running? Let's see if it asks me. There you go. So first look at this. We've got a whole ton of hello undefined showing up in the console. If you look over here at the right side, you can see the scroll bar is just huge, or very small, meaning a lot of scrolling. And we have a script may be busy, or it may have stopped responding. Let's say stop the script. And so we've stopped that script. And if I come back here, let's add that condition back in. I think I'm probably going to have to wait. It's going to tell me again. At this point, it may be quicker for me just to force quit Firefox and reopen it. And there we go. It opened this page again, and you can see that it ran properly once I added that back in there. But the point here is that understand, and this doesn't just work for for loops, but make sure you understand why these control structures work the way they do. Don't just accept them at face value. Understand why they do what they do. Experiment with them. Play with them. Try this kind of thing. Try leaving a condition out of an if loop, or have a blank case in your switch statement. Do something like that. Understand how they work. That's how you'll get to understand how the switch statement works, even though it's kind of tricky. Here, the for loop may seem pretty verbose or just hard to get your mind around at first, but if you just take it bit by bit and pull it apart the way we just have here, you're going to find that it makes more sense, and you'll understand not only how it works, but you'll understand how you can use it to be most effective. All right, so here we have a for statement with just one condition here in the top. We've taken everything else out. This reminds me of another conditional statement. Another looping statement that we're going to discuss next, and that is the while statement. The while statement is very simple. It's similar to the for loop, but it just has a condition. And while that condition is true, the code inside the while statement will continue to execute. So it'll execute the code. Well, first off, of course, it will check to see if the condition is true. If it is, it'll execute the code in the block. It'll check the condition again. Is it still true? If it is, it'll execute the code in the block. So you can see it's a simpler form of the for loop. And semantically, it's actually different too. When you have a for loop, you're saying for every item in a given collection, do something. For the while loop, you're saying while something is true or is not true, continue to execute. Now, I could, in the same way that we just had a for loop with just a condition in it, I could have a variable initialization and incrementing taken out of that for loop. I could do a similar thing with the while loop here, and up here I could say, well, I equals 0, and then down here I said I plus plus, and have something very similar to a for loop. But let's do something, as an example, let's do something a little more semantically correct, while something is correct. So as an example, say we're writing a little app that drives a car home. So let's say var not home equals true. And then we'll say miles driven equals 0. So while, that's not how you spell condition, is it? Oh well, we don't need it anymore. So while we are not home, let's say, and actually let's add one more variable here. We'll say miles to home equals, we'll say 10. So we're 10 miles from home. So while we're not home, miles driven plus plus, let's drive one more mile. And then let's check in here to say if miles driven, driven equals miles to home, then we'll say set not home to false. So notice what I've done here. I've actually nested a conditional statement inside of a looping statement. This is perfectly valid. Remember, we can nest statements inside of statements because this is just some lines of code, and anything that can go in a block, or any line of code that you can write outside of a block can go inside of a block as well, for the most part. So what we're saying is, while we are not home, increment the miles driven variable, so drive another mile, and if the miles that we have driven equals the number of miles that we started away from home, then set not home to false. So basically say that we are home. And once that happens, not home will be false. Once that becomes false, we no longer will continue to execute the block. So at the bottom here, I can console.log miles driven, and we know that miles driven should be equal to 10 because we were 10 miles away from home. So if I refresh this page, you'll see we get 10 here, as the output, because we were 10 miles away from home. All right, that's pretty basic. The while loop is really easy to get your head around in that way. So let's discuss one more thing before we call this chapter complete. And that is another format for using the for loop. In this case, it's called the for in loop. So let's create an object here. We'll just say, we'll call this object person. Equals, we'll give it a name. We'll say his name is Ed. And let's give him an age. His age is 49. And we'll give him a job. And his job is coder. Pretty simple. Now, let's say we want to do something for each of the properties in an object. We've seen how using the normal for loop, we can do something for each of the items in an array. Let's do something for each of the properties in an object. And what we do here is we create a variable, and I'll just put the variable in here for now, or declare the variable in here for now. So we say for each prop, which is just going to be short for property, in person. And then we have our block. Let's put property up there for now. We're going to say for prop in person. All right, here we go. So what does this do? For each property in person. Sorry about that. I'm not sure why my text editor is acting up on me like that. For each property in person, let's do something. So let's just console.log. Well, first of all, what are we getting in prop? Let's console.log whatever prop is. If we come over here and refresh the page, you'll see we're getting name, age, and job. And those are all strings. As you can tell, if I just do type of prop for your test that, you can see those are strings. So we're getting the name of the property, basically name, age, or job here. We're getting those as strings. So what we can do, if you'll recall, we can access object. Let's do this. So we'll say prop, then let me add a colon there. And then we can access properties on an object by using the square bracket notation, similarly to the way we do with arrays. So I'm going to say person prop. Let's refresh this, and you can see we have name, Ed, age, 49, job, coder. So this is how you use the for loop. We have prop here stands for the property name. Person is the object that we're iterating over. And inside the loop, we get propped for the property name. And if we want to get the property value, we use the square bracket notation. Now, you'll notice this is underlined in red, and this is because I have some JavaScript error detection enabled in my editor. We're going to talk about what this error is later on. It's a bit complex for you right now, but once we have some other things under our belt, we'll come back and talk about why you should never use a for-in loop in exactly the way we're doing it here. So we'll come back to that later, but that is the end of chapter 2. You've made it all the way through all the basic syntax. You've done an excellent job. And in chapter 3, we're going to start by discussing functions and get into some other really neat stuff. So I will see you there.